Hi everyone, welcome to the OklaRoots YouTube channel. Today we're going over block 3 for the OklaRoots block party. So this block is for May of 2020. Getting in the sewing room over these last few months has been such a therapeutic activity during this crazy time. And I can see for many of you it's the same. And I know some of us, we feel the weight of the world and we just decide there's no way we can create, and we start feeling kind of pressed down into the earth. You know what I'm saying? You feel heavy because it's a lot. It's all very, very heavy. You have a right to feel that way. But when we can get into our sewing rooms and we can make just something, anything, something small that lifts your spirit just enough to give you the strength you need to deal with the heavy. So I am so grateful to see so many of you guys making these projects, making these quilt blocks, and just knowing like you're not committing yourself to a huge quilt right now. You're just getting in the sewing room and making a quilt block. What we do with that later, who knows? Don't worry about it right now. We don't know anything that's going to happen in the future right now. So sincerely, thank you for participating in this block party. Whether you're doing it now or you're doing it in the future, these videos will be here forever. So any year, anytime, you are more than welcome to make these quilts. So this month's quilt block looks easy, and it's not terribly challenging. This is what we have here. It's pretty much just a plus sign with some squares around it. Very basic. You will not need to use templates for this if you don't want to. This is all very easy. I have all of the measurements for all of these pieces in the PDF, so very simple. But we have a lot of pieces. We have 21 pieces in this quilt block. And just a warning, this is not the quilt block that has the most pieces, so hold on to your hats, kids. But this month's quilt block has 21 pieces to it. What that means is that we have the possibility of ending up with a block that's too small. Remember last month we talked a lot about seam allowances and that scant quarter and seam allowance. And the more seams you have, the more likely it is that everything's going to measure up smaller than you want it to if you don't use the scant. This month, you're going to want to stay on top of your seam allowance. So this was a quilt block that I made when I was testing out the design. I used fabric, once again, that I didn't really love, just in case the design didn't work out and I had to chunk it. I really love this just basic design. This is a really fun one if you have a lot of small scraps. This is a great block for that because you can stick with the palette the way I have it, or you can make every single one of these blocks a different piece of fabric from a different line. So in preparing for the video, I made this block, which this is material from one of my absolute favorite lines of fabric. It's called Wonderland. It's by Rifle Paper Company. I just love all of that Alice in Wonderland detail in this. And so I use really cheerful, fun fabrics. I figure with the way things are, I just wanted to make a block that made me really happy. And this definitely does. So I just wanted to show you a couple different variations. You can go really crazy with your fabric. You can stay very muted, very calm. This is a great block for you to express yourself in any way you want this month. So before we get started, if you're not already a subscriber to the channel, please consider clicking subscribe down below. If at any point you like this video, please give it a like. Any questions, comments, shout outs, anything you want to say, leave them in the comment section down below. I will have timestamps listed in the comment section down below. It will be pinned to the very top. All you have to do is click on the number and it'll take you straight there in the video. Before we get started, if you are planning on printing out the pattern and using the templates to trace your design on your fabric, just make sure you print it using Adobe Acrobat Reader. And when you print it, you're going to print it at 100%. Don't let the printer size it down or else your quilt blocks will not be the right size. All right, let's get started. So here's our block for month 3. As you can see in the pattern, it uses 4 different colors. You are more than welcome to use a ton of different pieces of fabric, different lines, different colors. This is just the design I'm sticking with today. From color 1, you're going to need 8 cuts. From color 2, you're going to also need 8 cuts. From color 3, you're going to need 4 cuts. And from color 4, you'll need 1 cut. The measurements for all of these are in the pattern. Just go down to the description of this video where there will be a link to my website. All you have to do is click on the block for month 3. Once you're there, you can download the PDF to see the pattern, or if you have an automatic cutting machine like a Cricut or a Brother, you can download the SVG and let the machine do the cutting for you. Just a reminder that these patterns are 100% free, and my website currently does not ask for a credit card. So if somehow you get a pop-up or you click on a link that asks you for payment, just make sure you know that's not for this pattern. So as usual, I'll be using scraps for today's block. For color 1, I have this beautiful green fabric. For color 2, I'm using this white fabric with these yellow flowers. For the center of the block, I have this striped fabric. And for the rectangles, I'll be using this beautiful floral pattern. If you're going to be printing off the pattern pieces and tracing, I suggest using something like a friction pen or a sew line pencil to do that. For my thread today, I'll be using Aurifil 50 weight, and I'll be using a Microtex 7010 needle. You could also use a universal 7010 needle. To help me at the machine, I do like to use this seam ripper and stiletto combination. I get this from a shop on Etsy, and I will have links for all of these down in the description of the video. So first, let's cut out our fabric. I know I need 8 cuts from color 1. Since I'm using the same piece of fabric for all of the cuts, it's easiest if I just cut this down first and then cut it into smaller rectangles. The first step I'm going to do is cut a piece of this off that is 5 inches by 10 inches. Once I have my 5-inch by 10-inch rectangle, I can go ahead and cut this down in half. So I'll have 2 strips that are 2.5 inches by 10 inches. I can then stack these strips and rotate them. Make sure they're lined up perfectly at all 4 edges. And then with these 2 rectangles stacked, I can cut my 4 squares, each of them at 2.5 inches. And now I have 8 cuts from color 1 for the quilt block. You can go ahead and put these to the side. Let's do the same thing for color 2. So once again, I'm just trying to find a 5-inch by 10-inch space. If it doesn't line up perfectly on the rough edges, don't worry about that. We can just trim that down. Once I have those 2 edges trimmed down, I'm just going to remove my ruler and rotate my rectangle so that I have the 2 smoothly cut edges on the left and the bottom, and I can line up my 5-inch and 10-inch ruler marks on those lines, just like this, and now I can trim off the rest of the excess. And now I have my perfect 5-inch by 10-inch rectangle. Once again, just go ahead and trim this in half. I can go ahead and just stack these rectangles on top of one another and rotate them around. Just make sure they're smoothed out really nicely. And then just go down the rectangle, cutting your squares. There we go. Now we're done with color 2. Nice and simple. It's just 1 small square. So let's cut that out. Go ahead and put that to the side. And for the last cuts, we just need 4 rectangles. Again, I'm going to make this easier by cutting 1 large rectangle and then cutting that down. My rectangle needs to be 5 inches by 9 inches. Once I have 2 edges cut, I'm just going to rotate it and cut the remaining edges. 5 inches on the left and 9 inches on the bottom. Once again, we're going to go ahead and cut this in half down the long end. So I'm just going to line up my 2.5-inch mark on one edge of the fabric. Then go ahead and stack these rectangles on top of one another. Make sure all 4 of those edges are lined up really well before we cut. And this time we're just making 1 cut at 4.5 inches in. And now you should have 4 rectangles that are all the exact same size. Breaking down your cuts into large rectangles and then smaller and smaller rectangles is one of the quickest ways to cut out a lot of squares and rectangles in one go. Now let's lay out the design. Now you can get creative with this and lay this out in any design you like. The pattern is set up so that each one of the 4 corners has the squares laid out in the same manner. So color 1's going diagonally this way, and then color 2's going this way. But again, you can get so creative with this. You can completely change around the look of this block by just changing where you put these squares in the corners. So here we go. Here's a rough outline of what the block is going to look like. Now, we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to work on all of our squares first. So every color 1 is going to be paired up with a color 2. So you don't really have to be too particular with how you pin these together unless you have a directional print and you want it all to be in the same way. Then you really need to be careful about which way you're pinning your color 1 and color 2s together. Since I'm not using a directional print, I'm just going to take one of each color 1 and color 2, lay them right sides together, grab some pins, and then just pin them along one edge. Go ahead and do this for all of the square sets. So you should end up with 8 pin sets. We're going to take these to the sewing machine and we're going to sew along the pinned edges at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So once you're done sewing your blocks, you probably have a little banner just like this. I like to trim these before I press them. I know a lot of people that like to leave them as this banner while they're pressing. I think that's just personal choice, but for me, I do like to work with them individually. So if you used 2 fabrics like I did, meaning every single one of these sets has fabric color 1 and fabric color 2, what you want to do is pick the darker side fabric and lay that fabric wrong side up. So you can see for me, I have this green and this white. The green is the darker fabric, so I'm going to lay my little units with the green side wrong side up. I'm going to do a set press on all of these seams first, and then using my fingers, I'm going to lift up that top unit, so it's my green unit, and push it over that seam. So the goal is that this seam back here will be behind this top piece of fabric, and then I'm going to press on this seam. And you don't want to move your iron around when you're pressing your quilt blocks. You want to just hold it in one place just for a few seconds and then lift it up. Now I'm going to do this with all my quilt blocks. If you press the seam to the same colored fabric every single time, that's going to help you in the next step, and I'll show you that. But for right now, if you can, press your seams in the same direction each time. After I press the front, I like to flip them over and just give them one more press on the back. We just really want these to be as flat as possible. It makes it much easier to work with, and it makes sure that we don't end up with any sort of short seams. So I have 4 of my units done. I'm going to go ahead and do the other 4. Okay, so now we have all of the squares from colors 1 and 2 sewn together. Now we're going to sew these rectangles into those corner squares of the block. Now, the way it's designed is color 1 goes on the top left and on the bottom right, just like this. So we need to sew these along this middle seam. Fold them right sides together. And if you look, you can see that your seams are actually going in opposite directions. See how on the bottom the seam is going to the left, on the top the seam is going to the right. To make this easier, all you have to do is just snug in the folds from the seams just like this, like they're giving themselves a little otter hug, and then the sides should line up perfectly. There we go. See, and what this does is this is going to help reduce the bulk in the seam right here. So you're going to go ahead and do this with all of your units. You should end up with 4 pinned edges. Once you have all 4 of your units pinned together, let's go back to the sewing machine and sew along these pinned edges at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So once you have these sewn together, all you have to do is press along these seams and open them up. So just like before, I'm going to give them a press to set it, and then use my fingers to open up that seam, and then just press along the top. Once I have the top pressed, I'll flip it over and then just press on the back as well. And I am not using any steam when I press my quilt blocks. I just use a dry iron. There you go. Go ahead and do these for the other 2 units as well. Okay, so once you have your 4 squares sewn together, we're going to check these and make sure they're measuring right. These should measure at 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. If they're a little bit big, that's okay. If they're small, we're going to want to be careful with the next few steps and make sure we reduce the size of our seam allowance just a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and measure mine. To help with this, I'll find the 2 1/4 tick along the vertical edge and along the horizontal edge, and I'll just kind of line those up with those seams going crisscross across my square just like this, and then I'll trim this down. As you can see, there's not much to trim down. But keeping this the right size is going to help you a lot when piecing this onto the rest of the block. So once I have 2 edges done, I'll go ahead and rotate this and do the other 2 edges as well. So now I'm just lining up my ruler with the 4.5 inch mark on the left and the 4.5 inch mark on the bottom. And then I'll clean up the right and the top. There we go. Now I have a perfect 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch square. I'm going to do this for the other 3 units as well. If you find that this is not measuring up to 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches, that just means that your seam allowance is too big. It probably means you're using a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is too big. That's why we talk about the scant a lot. Taking the time right now to check yourself lets you clean up your blocks, which is very important when you have a lot of pieces like you do in this quilt block. But it also lets you kind of reevaluate what you're doing. So if this is measuring smaller than you want, moving forward, we're going to try to change our seam allowance just a little bit, maybe make it just a tiny bit smaller. And if you pressed your seams the way I explained and you nested them, you should find that this corner right here, this is lining up very nicely. Okay, so now all 4 of my squares are squared up and cleaned up. So now let's put them back in the block. So here is the center of our block. We can just add our squares in the corners in whatever direction you want. This is the way I'm laying it out, but switch it around however you like. So now we're going to break this up into 3 columns, like I usually do. And we're going to work on each column first and then sew them all together. So from the column on the far right, I'm going to take my middle rectangle here and I'm going to lay it right side down on my bottom square and just line it up with the edge of the square. And if you squared up this bottom square down here, it should line up perfectly with your rectangle. So there's the right column. For the center column, I'm going to take my center square, and if you have a direction, make sure you figure that out now. And I'm going to fold that down to that rectangle on the bottom, lining it up with that short edge of the rectangle, and just pin that together. And then for the left column, I'm once again going to take this rectangle in the center and fold it right side down on that bottom square, lining up along that edge, and then just pin together. So now I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to take each one of these 3 units and sew at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance along the pinned edge. So here are the bottoms of our 3 columns. To make it easy to nest these together when we sew the columns together, make sure your units with the rectangles, just like this, have the rectangle side wrong side up, and then take your center unit and lay that so that its rectangle unit is wrong side up. Not the square unit, the rectangle unit, just like that. So every single piece should have the rectangle wrong side up. And now we're going to press these so that the seams are behind those rectangles. Okay, back at our layout, let's go ahead and add the tops to each column. So I'm just going to take the top of the right column and lay that right sides together along that rectangle and pin in place. What I'm checking right here is to make sure that these vertical edges on the sides are lined up, that this isn't twisted in any way. You want to make sure this is nice and straight here because then when you sew this, it'll stay straight as a column in the end. Take that rectangle unit in the middle and lay that right side down against that middle square. Again, making sure the sides are lined up nicely. And then pin in place. And for the left column, do the same thing. Lay that corner square unit down against the rectangle. Okay, now we're going back to the sewing machine and we're going to sew along each of these pinned edges at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, once again, let's lay out our blocks so that the rectangle that is sewn on that seam we just did is wrong side up. We want these seams to go behind the rectangles. So you can see for the 2 outer columns, I have the rectangle on the top, same with the middle, except it's the short end of the rectangle. Give them a quick press on their seams and then open them up. And then let's press them on the back as well. So here we are, we have our 3 columns. I'm going to work with the right-hand column in the middle, so I'm just going to put the left-hand column to the side. Now I'm going to take this middle column and I'm going to lay it right side down against my right-hand column. If you look from the top down, you can see that the seams on the right hand and the seams in the middle column are going in opposite directions. So once again, we can just hug those edges together. It keeps the seam flat. It also makes sure that you have those perfect points that meet up in the center of the block. So then just pin along this entire long edge. And now we're going to take this to the sewing machine and we're going to sew along this pinned edge at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now we're going to go ahead and press this open. I like to press it with the rectangles, again, wrong side up, just because it has less seams and it's a little bit easier to keep flat. So press along the seam and then just open it up and press it right side up. On the back, go ahead and press that seam as well. All right, last one. We're going to lay our left column right side down to that center column. Just like before, our seams should be going in opposite directions if we pressed it the way we discussed. So all you have to do is nestle those folded edges together just like that, and then pin along this edge. So now we're going to take this to the sewing machine and sew along this pinned edge at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, so when pressing this again, I do like to keep those seams behind the long rectangles. So I have the center strip wrong side up, and I'll just press it once, open up the block, and press along the seams on the right side. And now since we're done sewing, if you want to give your block a really, really light spritz of starch, I like to use Mary Ellen's Best Press. And I mean, don't soak it, just really nice light mist. You're going to spray it from the back and then just gently press these seams down. What that does is it just kind of lets these seams lay nice and flat. You can see that in some areas they're rolling up. And when we're piecing the quilt together with these blocks or using them in any other way, having these seams flat is going to be more useful. And you want to make sure it's a very light mist when you starch the fabric right here. If it's too much starch, it can make your fabric start to wrinkle and warp. So now I'm going to use my rotating mat and my 10.5 inch by 10.5 inch ruler to trim down my block and just make sure it's the right size. Just lay my ruler over it. Try to keep it centered as best as possible. Use the grid lines to make sure everything's lined up right. You don't have it twisted in any way. And then just use your rotary cutter to cut along the side and rotate the mat as you go so you don't have to worry about anything shifting out of place. And there we go. If you lift up your block, you can see got off a little bit of excess. And there you go. There's block 3. All right. So here's our block. You know what's funny is that when I was picking out the fabrics for this block, I really didn't think about it. I mean, you guys have seen, if you watched block 1, you've seen my process of how I pull colors. I pretty much just randomly pulled out stuff out of this right here, which is my scrap bin. And what's funny is that this screams spring, right? I mean, this screams May and flowers and grass and everything green and blossoming. And in my personal life, I have been planting a ton of flowers. I'm trying to get my green thumb going, and I have been really, really into that. And I feel like subconsciously, that's why I picked these patterns. So I think that that's what's so much fun about making these blocks is sometimes you go into it knowing like, this is what I want to use because this is what I'm feeling this month. And other times you're just like, you know what, whatever, I'll pick it, I don't care. And then you throw it together and you go, oh, that is what I was feeling today. I didn't even know. So quilt blocks are such a beautiful way to create something special. And like we said, 2020 is a year we're all going to be working on together. It is a year that is going down in the history books. And it is a year that I want to remember from my point of view with this quilt, our 2020 Block of the Month quilts will tell stories for generations to come. And I'm so excited to hear about what yours is telling, and I'm so excited to share more of mine. So thank you so much for watching the video today. Thank you so much for making these blocks and getting as excited about all of this coming together as I am. I know it's hard. I know sometimes we have dark days and other days we have good days, and it's just up and down all the time. I'm feeling the exact same thing that you guys are feeling. But we can do this. We can get through this, and we can take care of each other. I don't like using the term a new normal, because what is normal? This is temporary, but at the same time everything is temporary. I mean, if you go on a cruise for the next 4 to 7 days, that's your new normal. If you go on vacation for however long you're there, that's your new normal. So normal is changing every day. And sometimes it's a good change and sometimes it's not, and it's hard. But we can adapt. We can come out of this as better people, and we can use this time to really learn about ourselves and what we're capable of and what we can create and what kind of joy we can bring other people and what kind of joy we can bring ourselves. I hope you're getting something positive from this experience, and I hope that these videos can contribute to that positivity. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have a great rest of the week. Get out there and make something.